Coming up on this episode of Crime Family.
So why would he give 3 different responses if there was totally an innocent explanation?
In 15 minutes, he would have had to murder Ron, as Nicole was likely already dead, go to his vehicle, and then, as bloody footprints show, he would have gone back to the crime scene for some reason, then changed his clothes, hidden the murder weapon or weapons, got home, and then be ready for his limo ride.
I'm sorry for the Goldman family. I know how much it hurts. Don't feel sorry for me. I've had a great life.
The presumed vehicle of O.J. Simpson is still traveling very slowly northbound along the 5 freeway, coming up again towards the 91 intersection.
I don't really think he was actually going to commit suicide. I don't think that was even a thought in his head. I think this whole chase was just trying to get a rouse out of his fans and out of the media.
Hey everybody, welcome back to Crime Family. We are now on part 2 of our O.J. Simpson case coverage. I'm Katie, and I'm here with my brother and sister, AJ and Steph. In case you missed it, you should go back and listen to our first episode. We introduce O.J. and the crime scene, kind of a little bit about his background. And this episode, we are going to kind of get into the nitty-gritty of the trial and some of the controversial evidence, some of the different theories that are out there regarding the Nicole Brown Simpson and the Ron Goldman murder trial with O.J. Simpson.
So Jeffrey Toobin, a longtime journalist, describes in the O.J. Made in America documentary that during the police's first interview with O.J. that day, they made a fatal error by not pinning down what he did on the day of the murder. So when he returns to L.A. from Chicago, the first thing that they do is they want to question him about his whereabouts the previous night to determine, whether he is a suspect or if he has an alibi that can clear him. And so as Jeffrey's describing this in the documentary about the police weren't able to definitively pin down what he was doing on the day or the evening that the murders happened. And he says that OJ rambled and went from topic to topic in an unclear description and narrative. So he said statements such as, quote, "I was running around doing what I do," end quote, which is obviously super vague and definitely not useful to the prosecution in a criminal trial or to the defense. What is doing what you do? What does that entail? And so the police failed to clarify these statements or push back on known facts, such as the blood that was on the door handle of the Bronco. So they really did a terrible job in this first questioning based on what Jeffrey Toobin's describing in this documentary. So if OJ says that he cut his hand in Chicago, then how did the blood get on the door handle before he even left for Chicago? And he never even mentioned anything about cutting his hand in LA before leaving for Chicago. So it's just like, you could say if he cut his hand in LA and then touched his door handle, that would be how his blood was on there. But he didn't cut his hand until he was in Chicago. So how does that explain the blood on the Bronco? So just a lot of details that were left unclear when they let him out of that interview room. So they did take photos of the cut on his hand and they did draw his blood, which were to be used as evidence. And then he was free to go. So just a lot of errors in that initial questioning for sure.
And so that morning when he was brought in for questioning, only about 55 minutes of the questioning was audio recorded. There was nothing that the prosecution could find that would be helpful for them. There was nothing incriminating said. And OJ did not seem defensive. He just seemed very nonchalant. So in that book that I had mentioned in the previous episode, The Truth About the O.J. Simpson Trial, written by one of OJ's defense lawyers, F. Lee Bailey, he outlines 5 pillars of innocence that he kind of presents to convince everybody why OJ is innocent. And he says if all these pillars are true, then OJ has to be considered innocent. And so one of these is related to OJ's demeanor. And they say by all accounts, OJ's demeanor that day of the murders, but prior to the murders, he was acting very normal. So he was relaxed, he was enjoying the day. He didn't seem like someone who was planning or thinking about murdering anyone. So you can think about maybe if someone has something like that on their mind, how they might act. Even after the murders, before he was told about them, he was acting the same, nothing strange. So if you, again, think of someone that had just brutally murdered 2 people, how you would think that they would be acting. But apparently OJ was just being himself still, even after the murders, before he had found out. Or before he was told about them anyway. And then it wasn't until after he got the call about the murders, that's when he started to act very distraught and panicked to get back home, because he was in Chicago. And so Bailey describes OJ's statement to the police as, quote, flawless. He says that someone who does not have a legal or law enforcement background, if guilty but trying to act innocent, would have a very hard time not slipping up or raising some sort of suspicion during questioning. But it seemed clear that maybe besides some of the rambling that AJ was talking about, it seemed clear that OJ really didn't have any idea what had happened, and he told a story that completely corroborated with some of the other events that had happened earlier in the day.
So the police released OJ, like I said, but they were later criticized for giving him special treatment because of who he was. So my question is, would the LAPD just let a random person leave that day without pinning down these important details? Those are something you would really want to get. And they also mentioned in the documentary, you have one opportunity to interview OJ before he lawyers up or before the investigation goes deeper. So you really have this one chance to get these details pinned down to kind of outline the basis of your theory. It's really important information. It's a really important interview. They just didn't take the time to kind of get that information from him. And so the LAPD argued, that because OJ was so famous, it's not really easy for someone like him to just vanish and blend in with people if he wanted to disappear. So they were saying, they don't think he's going to flee, but if he did, he would be very easy to capture because everyone in the world knew who he was. He couldn't just go incognito, really. After his release, he went back to his home, and when asked about the cut on his finger by a friend, he gave a different response. This time, he said that he was, quote, chipping golf balls, end quote, whatever that means. Then a third response when asked again by someone else that he cut his finger when he was getting his cell phone out of his Bronco. So why would he give 3 different responses if there was totally an innocent explanation? This again is circumstantial, but in any criminal investigation, changing your explanation multiple times never looks good during a trial. And the third explanation could potentially explain why there's blood on the door handle of the Bronco. But was he informed? My question was, maybe he had already been informed by this point that they found blood on the door handle, so he therefore then changed his story that was going to match that piece of evidence, which could be used against him. So in this short amount of time, there's already several things that point to OJ being involved in the murders or knowing more than he's saying, just from a plain common sense perspective. But of course, not everything is admissible in court, and criminal trials are never so straightforward. So I can guarantee, though, that if you point out just the facts in the case that we've outlined so far, most people would at the very least be skeptical or unsure about his innocence or guilt either way. So just a lot of shady things happening so far. OJ also declined requests for a polygraph test in the early days of the investigation, and he admitted to one of his friends that he had been asked to do a polygraph but declined. And when he was pressed on it, he explained that he had, quote, dreams of killing her, end quote, meaning Nicole, which could maybe lead him to fail the polygraph test, which is why he declined one. And through police interviews and investigative evidence, the LAPD were able to put together a timeline of events on the night of June 12th, which is then presented in detail in OJ Made in America in the documentary. So I'm going to kind of outline this timeline that they go through just to give a better idea of what they believe is the timeline of that night. At 5 p.m. on June 12th, OJ, Nicole, and the rest of the family attend OJ and Nicole's daughter's dance recital. At 6:30 p.m., Nicole and her family go to the restaurant Mezzaluna to eat after the recital. OJ was not invited to attend this dinner for obvious reasons. Then the next piece in the timeline is at 9:36 p.m., OJ and Kato Kalin return to OJ's residence after a trip to McDonald's. They part ways upon their return. OJ goes into his own house and Kato goes into his bungalow at the back of the property. At 9:37 p.m., Nicole Brown's mother calls the restaurant Mezzaluna looking for her missing glasses. And then at approximately 10 p.m., Mezzaluna waiter Ron Goldman leaves the restaurant and takes an envelope with the missing glasses inside to Nicole's residence. Ron and Nicole were good friends, and he knew where Nicole lived, which was very close to Mezzaluna, so he was the obvious choice to bring the glasses to her. Then at 10:15 p.m., neighbors hear Nicole's dog barking, which I explained in the previous part. 11:15 p.m., OJ is picked up at his Rockingham residence by a limo driver, and he was going to be taken to the airport for a flight to Chicago. And then at 11:45 p.m., the flight departs LAX en route to Chicago. So those are kind of like the basic agreed timeline of facts in this case. So, after they go to the dance recital, then the next thing is at 9:30 when OJ and Kato go to McDonald's and they come home. And then OJ comes out of his house at 11:15 to go to the airport. So based on this timeline, the prosecution in the case would go on to theorize that the murders took place between 10 and 10:15 p.m. after Ron Goldman left Mezzaluna with the glasses and before the neighbors hear the dog barking at 10:15. And this is a period of time when OJ's whereabouts were unaccounted for. His last known location was his home after returning from McDonald's with Kato Kalin, so the defense claims that OJ was at his home during the time the prosecution argues the murder occurred. However, nobody knows that OJ was actually at his home between the time he and Kato went their separate ways and the time the limo picked him up about an hour and a half later. So there is that 90 minutes where his whereabouts are unknown.
So it's interesting because there are some details here that are slightly different regarding the timeline of events that night. And this brings me to one of those other pillars of innocence that Bailey outlines in his book. And he also makes a point to say that the police records had some falsified details. And he said that they were intentionally falsified by investigators to kind of fit this timeline of events that fit kind of the police's agenda rather than what actually happened. And so some important details surrounding the timeline that night of June 12th. OJ was scheduled to be in Chicago on the 13th, so he had a red-eye flight that night scheduled, like we know. And that flight left at 11:45 p.m. from the Los Angeles airport. So his limo driver was Alan Park. He testified that he showed up at 10:25 p.m., which was about 20 minutes earlier than OJ was expecting him. Apparently, he wasn't OJ's usual limo driver. It was a new guy, and he had never been to OJ's place before, so he wanted to get there early just so that, he wasn't late for OJ and that, he was just doing a good job. So when he got there, Park saw no sign of movement in OJ's house. He buzzed the front gate around 10:40, but after buzzing the intercom, there was no answer for several minutes and after several attempts. And he noticed that the lights were off in OJ's house and no one appeared to be home at all. So he smoked a cigarette and he made several calls to his boss while he waited. He was behind the gate because he didn't have the pin to get in to the actual driveway. And he says that he saw no vehicle or people come and go between the time he arrived and 10:55, which is when he notices a figure in the entryway heading into OJ's house. And he also says he notices a small dark bag in the entryway. And this is when OJ finally tells Park over the intercom that he had overslept. And that's when they start to load all of the bags into the limo. And apparently OJ wouldn't let anyone handle that one particular small dark bag. And I guess Kato even came out to help load the bags into the limo. And OJ was the only one that could touch this bag for whatever reason. So it was around the same time, apparently, 10:55, that residents of Nicole's neighborhood around Bundy Drive found Nicole's dog wandering around the streets. But they didn't know at the time that it was actually her dog. It was noted that the dog seemed to be very agitated and it looked to have mud or blood caked onto its paws. After a bit, they walked the dog around and it stopped directly in front of Nicole's front gate. And the person walking the dog looked down the walkway, past the gate, and saw a body lying on the walkway. And of course, police were called and they arrived around 12:30 a.m. on June 13th. And so in his book, Bailey goes on to explain that timeline evidence is sometimes even better than an alibi, because he says that in this case, there's multiple people that can corroborate certain activities rather than just like one person saying, this is what I did, this is where I was. In this case, there's like multiple people stringing together a series of events. And so on the night of the murders, at about 10 p.m., a man named Tom Lang says he saw a man who was white or Hispanic, about 5 feet 11 inches, standing in front of Nicole's gate with his fists clenched in a menacing stance, he says. He also says he saw a blonde woman standing beside a truck, dressed in dark clothing, talking or maybe arguing with a man inside the truck. And now Bailey claims that some of the details of Tom's account of this to the police report were falsified by police. For example, they wrote that the woman that Tom saw was actually wearing a white flowing dress instead of the dark clothes that Tom reportedly said he saw the woman wearing, which is what Nicole was wearing, was dark clothing that night. It's kind of presumed that the police were trying to disconnect what Tom saw to the murder of Nicole, because they're saying, well, this woman wasn't wearing what Nicole was wearing, so it wasn't actually Nicole. So whether that's, true, whether it was falsified, that's just what Bailey describes in his book. Other witnesses say that at 10:25, there was no commotion in the area, and at 10:35 is actually when the dog starts barking. And police apparently tried to get that witness to change the time that she reported to better fit their timeline. So they tried to get her to say that the dog started barking at 10:15, not 10:35. And that 10:15 is kind of what is presented by the prosecution as the timeline, when actually they're saying it was 10:35. Another witness recalls hearing a man yelling, "Hey, hey, hey," at around 10:40, which is thought to be Ron yelling at the scene. And then around 10:50, that same witness sees a large, light-colored vehicle speeding away from the scene in the opposite direction that you would go if you were going to OJ's house, apparently. So basically the point here that they're trying to make is that if Ron was still alive at 10:40 and OJ was seen in his own driveway by the limo driver at 10:55, in 15 minutes he would have had to murder Ron, as Nicole was likely already dead, go to his vehicle, and then, as bloody footprints show, he would have gone back to the crime scene for some reason, then changed his clothes, hidden the murder weapon or weapons, got home, very carefully cleaned himself up as to not leave blood evidence everywhere, and then be ready for his limo ride. So he would have done all that in 15 minutes, apparently.
So this is like very two different accounts or approaches. And so it's like interesting, how time gets to be so important in this case, because, you look at the exact timeline or the certain times that things are said to have happened. And obviously, depending on the time that you believe certain events happen, could change what you think. And I think, like, just to say, the hey, hey, hey at 10:40 is just thought to be Ron yelling at the scene. But is there anything to, like, confirm this? Because, like, to me, the limo driver seeing a shadowy figure walk into OJ's house, it's very clearly it's OJ. There was no sign of a breaking and entering. It didn't say someone was breaking into the house, just someone walking in. So that person walking into the house, OJ's house at 10 or whatever time that was clearly OJ. So that's something that you can't really refute. But I feel like the hey, 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 why someone's saying that's Ron yelling at the scene is something that can be refuted. Do we know that? Like, that could have been anybody from anywhere saying that for any other reason. Whereas I feel like it's very easy to dismiss that as something else. Whereas the OJ, someone walking into his house at that time. You know what I mean? So I feel like the defense's case
agree.
is like something that can easily be debunked.
Yeah. So that's what I was thinking as well. Like that hey, 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 nobody has any proof that was Ron. Nobody actually saw him say that and yell that at that time. So yeah, somebody could have said that at 10:40, but we have no actual evidence or proof that it was Ron. Also, when that guy said that he saw someone standing in front of Nicole's gait with like, you know, he has hands and fists and he's like a menacing stance. It's like, okay, maybe, but that doesn't mean that. And they said it was a white or Hispanic person, so that doesn't prove that OJ wasn't there as well. You know what I mean? So this could have been an actual person, but had nothing to do with the actual murder. So these are all just pieces of things that may not have been relevant at all.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, and also the light colored vehicle you said going in the opposite way, like OJ did drive a white Bronco and he could have just drove in the opposite direction and then turned and circled back around to go back to his place. So like just because they went in the opposite direction of his house originally doesn't mean that he didn't then go back to the right direction. You know what I mean? And he did have a light colored vehicle. It was like white.
And it also could have been somebody else in a white colored car that was just driving the other way that had nothing to do with it. You know what I mean? It didn't have to be OJ going the opposite way, turning around. It could have just been somebody else.
But yeah, so I was thinking like all the pieces that you described with the defense saying like, you know, Ron at 1040 and like the other person, the menacing person, like those are all things that I can easily pick apart. Whereas like, yes, we only have the limo driver's word that he saw someone enter OJ's house. But like to me, the limo driver has no reason to lie and also be like somebody walking into OJ's house is very clearly OJ if it's not a break-in, right? And OJ never comes out and says like, oh, I was somewhere and then went into the house at this time. Like he was saying he was sleeping. So, you know, OJ couldn't even say like, oh yeah, that was me, but it was because of this, not, you know what I mean? Like, I just feel like something can be very easily disputed and something can't.
Yeah. And also in another documentary that I know Steph and I both watched, the one called Is OJ Innocent? They talk to the limo driver and he actually comes out and talks to the investigators. And he says that he feels that OJ is innocent just kind of by the events that happened with him that night, when he saw OJ, how OJ was acting, and then the news that came out later about the murders. He feels like, yeah, for sure it was OJ. So yeah, the limo driver isn't hiding anything, and he's not on OJ's side after all this either. So that's interesting. What do you guys think so far about the allegations that the police reports were kind of falsified for the timeline, and also the woman wearing a white dress and not the black clothing that Nicole was found to be wearing? Do you think that they were actually falsified intentionally, maybe by mistake? You guys have any thoughts on that?
I mean, mistakes can happen. I don't think it was intentional. I think maybe they might have got mixed information or something. But I mean, as we see in a lot of cases, like police information sometimes never accurate or something goes wrong. But to me, it doesn't seem like it was on purpose. But I don't know.
And yeah, like I don't think it was, if it was a mistake and it was inaccurate, it wasn't a purposeful thing. But also, I mean, the defense is trying to argue, as we'll get into in later parts, like that there was lots of evidence that was planted, or that this whole thing was like a cover up or like a frame job, or I guess. So like for the defense to say that the police reports were falsified, like of course they're going to say that because that lines up with every other part of their defense, that, you know, these were like crooked cops who were trying to plant evidence in places. So to me, it's like you have to consider the source in some parts too. Like, although I guess, or was it a known fact that they were falsified, or it's like the defense saying that?
Yeah, so it was all came up in that book that the defense lawyer wrote. And like it's their claims that it was falsified. So I don't know if it actually was. I haven't actually seen any other evidence either way. Also, yeah, and I just want to say now that a lot of the stuff that I'm going to be talking about from this book, I'm not saying I necessarily believe it. This is just kind of what is represented in this book. And a lot of it is now considered to kind of be like a conspiracy theory that the police were trying to frame OJ. So yeah, just putting it out there. But I don't necessarily think that's what happened. I'm just reiterating what was in this book. Just to have another perspective. I think it's always interesting to have like another view of, you know, the case. There's always two sides to the story.
Because and when you were like outlining that argument of like the alternate timeline or like the different timeline, like I was trying to picture it in my mind too. So it's like good to have that, to see like if you can picture a different scenario. Because sometimes you get so focused on like tunnel vision of one scenario. So it's good to hear like that other side and kind of play it out in your mind as you were talking of like, well, this is what they're trying to pass off as the timeline.
Later on in this case, like when I talk about the documentary that I watched, like the one that me and Katie watched, it does go along and it talks a lot about timeline and certain people's timelines and how some people's timelines are like iffy. And going back to like the trial, like was there any like witnesses besides Kato and the limo driver that night? Like anybody else? Because like where OJ and them lived, it was like super popular area. So I feel like, and plus it's LA, so I feel like at that time of night there's a lot of commotion going on. I feel like somebody would have seen something.
It was like in Brentwood, so it's like a suburb, like a rich, ritzy neighborhood suburb of LA, and it was also like 10, 11 at night, so it's not going to be like super busy or like lots of people walking around.
Yeah, it's not like downtown LA, like bar scene,
guess,
clubs. Yeah. It's like a suburb, right? But and he also lived like he was his whole estate was gated.
True.
And stuff.
Yeah, these are all rich
and
people.
And he didn't live with
in
anybody
this area.
else but Kato. It was the only person that lived on his property. Like he didn't live with any of. I don't think he lived with any of his kids. Did he? Like her kids weren't. It was just him by himself in the house.
I believe so.
I think so.
Yeah, especially that night, right? Because the limo driver said there was no lights on. There was no. It's not like anybody was there while he was ringing the buzzer. None of the lights were on in the house. It was just until he saw that figure at 10:55 kind of emerging and then go inside the house and then turn all the lights on. And that's when he, used the buzzer. And so that's the thing. Like nobody was with OJ in like this whole time that the murders were happening, right? So it's not like he has a solid alibi to be like, yeah, I was with this guy. It's like I was home alone and I overslept. I was sleeping. So that's what makes the whole thing really sketchy, right?
Yeah, and like of course that's your defense, like a time when you would have no one else around you. Because obviously if you say you're with someone, they're going to question that person and then you'll be caught in your lie if you weren't really with them, right? So it's easy to just
and
say
that's
you're
why the
sleeping.
defense. Yeah, that's why the defense is so like gung ho with this timeline theory, because OJ just saying that he was home sleeping is not a good alibi, but then other people having this other timeline saying that he didn't have enough time to do it is why they're very much like, the police falsified it, the timeline's not right, here's the actual timeline. That's why they're pushing that hard.
We all know in like a lot of cases that we've done throughout this whole entire podcast is that timelines are like probably one of the most important things to corroborate someone's story. If you don't have a timeline of where you are, you don't really have a reason for people to believe you that's where you were. So to have all these different conflicting timelines is something that you really have to try and figure out what was the right one.
And like we do know for sure, like we know Ron leaves Mezzaluna, the restaurant, shortly at like right before or like after 10 p.m. So we know that the murders happened after 10 p.m. between like the 10 o'clock window and like shortly after midnight when they're found. So there is like that 2 hours in there. And those are times when the only time that OJ is actually accounted for is 11:15 when he comes out of his house, or the 10:55 when the limo driver says he saw what he believes to be OJ going into the house. We can confirm that 11:15 was he came out of his house. So what was he doing between 9:36 and 11:15? Apparently sleeping. Because this case was so high profile too, like you did have people coming out of the woodwork. You didn't know if you could believe half their stories, but there was someone who said that she was actually at an intersection and OJ was also at that intersection in his white Bronco. She said it was OJ behind the wheel, and apparently her like story put him like at the intersection closest to Nicole's house, like right around the time that the murders are believed to have happened. However, she didn't testify in the trial because the prosecution found out that she had sold her story to like the National Enquirer or like some tabloid. So then, of course, that discredited her story and they couldn't use her in the trial, which is unfortunate. And so who knows if that's actually true, but she did sell her story to the tabloid. So that kind of questions her legitimacy. But if you believe what she said, then that would put him in the intersection closest to Nicole's home, like right around that time that they believe the murders happened. So I don't know, just a lot of stuff going on, and we don't know for sure, obviously.
She does come forward later and says that she totally regrets, like if she could go back, she wouldn't, so that they would have kind of more solid proof against OJ, just for the record. She's not happy with herself about that.
Yeah, so just a lot of different testimony or different stories, I guess, if you believe the prosecution or the defense, and we'll never know exactly for sure, but, some facts are more believable than others, of course. So just a little bit more kind of going back to the timeline, just one last thing. So around the time of 10:55, when, limo driver says that he saw the shadowy figure emerge and enter the home. That's also around the same time that Cato testified that he heard the loud thumps that were just outside his bungalow. Remember, he said that he heard, a thump on the wall or close to the wall and shook his picture that he thought was an earthquake. So that is around the time that he said that happened as well. So when he heard those, Cato went outside to kind of investigate the noises, but he didn't really walk into the immediate area that the thumps came from. He just kind of went around and looked. But then it was in that area around where the thumps were said to have taken place that's the area that Mark Furman said he discovered the brown leather glove that was just behind the bungalows, kind of like on the other side of this fence. So it's kind of suggesting that maybe that those thumps were OJ kind of coming over the fence. And that's the thumps that Cato heard. And then he dropped the glove in that moment as he was returning and then walked around. And then at 10:55, that shadowy figure emerges. So all of those times all line up. And then Cato says like he went and looked outside to see if there was anything happening when he heard the thumps. And then he walked around to the front of the property, and that's when he saw the limousine parked outside. The limo driver was then buzzed into the gate, and OJ came outside of the home shortly after, like we said, and claimed that he overslept. So that's kind of like the night of the murders and the established timelines by both sides. So like I said, once news broke of the murders, it was, a huge breaking news story that was, all over, CNN and all of the news stations. Nicole and Ron Goldman's funerals were held a few days after their murders, and OJ was actually in attendance at Nicole's wake. And people at the wake and Nicole's sister Tanya, she says in the OJ Made in America documentary that, they were all in shock that he would attend because around the time of the funerals, OJ was under a lot of suspicion for being Nicole and Ron's murderer. And the media circus that was surrounding the case was reaching a fever pitch. And so it just brought a lot of attention to the wake and the funeral, the fact that OJ was there and mourning with everyone. Shortly after, OJ and his attorney, Robert Shapiro, they were actually reported to make a deal to have OJ surrender to authorities in order to avoid any more of a media circus because, murder charges against him were already looming due to the amount of evidence that was compiling against him in the early days of the investigation. So, they were actually scheduled to have OJ turn himself in on June 17th, the morning of June 17th, which was only like 3-4 days after the murders had happened. So this is all taking place within a relatively short amount of time. But obviously they deemed that it was just the best thing to have OJ surrender at that point to authorities. So he was scheduled to turn himself in at 11 a.m., but when 11 a.m. comes around, OJ doesn't show up, and it looks like he's just gone on the run or just is refusing to turn himself in, which was already the deal. So a press conference was scheduled already in advance, and that's when they were going to announce the surrender of OJ. But instead, the LAPD police chief, David Gaskin, had to go live on air and announce that while they had officially charged OJ with Ron and Nicole's murders, he didn't arrive to turn himself in, and that he was now considered a wanted man and a fugitive. Kind of ironic that OJ's attorney said that he was going to be turning himself in to avoid a media circus, but it was actually then OJ's disappearance that caused an even bigger media circus. So if he didn't want a media circus, then going on the run and being a fugitive was the last thing that should have happened. Of course, all television and radio channels were tuned in live to hear news updates on the status of the investigation. And attorney Robert Kardashian read a letter that was written by OJ at the press conference. I think it was a press conference that was later that day. And the letter read, quote, "First, everyone understand.
I had nothing to do with Nicole's murder. I loved her, always have, and always will. If we had a problem, it's because I loved her so much. Recently, we came to the understanding that for now, we were not right for each other, at least for now. Despite our love, we were different, and that's why we mutually agreed to go our separate ways. It was tough splitting for a second time, but we both knew it was for the best. Inside, I had no doubt that in the future we would be close friends or more. Unlike what has been written in the press, Nicole and I had a great relationship for most of our lives together. Like all long-term relationships, we had a few downs and ups. I took the heat New Year's 1989 because that's what I was supposed to do. I did not plead no contest for any other reason but to protect our privacy, and was advised it would end the press hype. I don't want to belabor knocking the press but I can't believe what is being said. Most of it is totally made up. I know you have a job to do, but as a last wish, please, please, please leave my children in peace. Their lives will be tough enough. Paula, what can I say? You are special. I'm sorry we're not going to have our chance. God brought you to me. I now see, as I leave, you'll be in my thoughts. I think of my life and feel I've done most of the right things. So why do I end up like this? I can't go on. No matter what the outcome, people will look and point. I can't take that. I can't subject my children to that. This way they can move on and go on with their lives. Please, if I've done anything worthwhile in my life, let my kids live in peace from you, the press. I've had a good life. I'm proud of how I lived. My mama taught me to do unto others. I treated people the way I wanted to be treated. I've always tried to be up and helpful. So why is this happening? I'm sorry for the Goldman family. I know how much it hurts. Nicole and I had a good life together. All this press talk about a rocky relationship was no more than what every long-term relationship experiences. All her friends will confirm that I have been totally loving and understanding of what she's been going through. At times, I have felt like a battered husband or boyfriend, but I loved her. Make that clear to everyone, and I would take whatever it took to make it work. Don't feel sorry for me. I've had a great life, great friends. Please think of the real OJ and not this lost person.
End quote. And this sounds to me, at least, very much like a suicide note. And so that was kind of what was going through people's minds. Like, is he going to commit suicide? Is he going to kill himself out of guilt for what he did? Or that was kind of the speculation or, the fear at that time. So you can imagine, one of the biggest celebrities in Hollywood at this time being accused of these murders, being charged for them, and then going on the run and being a fugitive. Like, you can imagine if that were to happen today. Like, think of the biggest celebrity today. And if they were accused of murder and then went on the run, how much of a breaking news story that would be. So that's kind of what was happening. It was just all over the news, and everyone was kind of pinned to their TVs to see where this was going to go and what was going to happen next. So after this revelation of the note that OJ wrote, it looked like maybe he did end up taking his own life, or that he was planning to, out of guilt for what he did. But of course, if you know anything about this case, that's not at all what was going to happen. So shortly after this, the LAPD actually spot OJ's white Ford Bronco on the freeway, driving at a slow pace with OJ's childhood friend Al Cowlings at the wheel. And OJ reportedly is sitting in the back of the Bronco with a gun to his head. And so, there's a helicopter overhead that spots this Ford Bronco, and they get patched into the local news channel. And then all of a sudden, all the news channels are following this white Bronco as it drives down the highway with a series of police cars following behind. And it was like a slow speed chase. So they weren't like speeding down the highway. It was all very at a slow speed, but still, kind of captivated the world as they're all watching this take place live.
The intersection of the 5 and the 91 freeway. One thing we have been noticing, again, it's a very slow pursuit, followed by numerous highway patrol vehicles, but because of the intensity, it seems like people have heard about what's going on, and all the overpasses that we've seen have been lined with cars. What has been going on down below as the presumed vehicle of O.J. Simpson is still traveling very slowly northbound along the 5 freeway, coming up again towards the 91 intersection. At that point, we'll just have to wait and see which way he's going to go, but at this point, it's still a fairly laid-back situation, a dangerous situation at the same time, because again, the highway patrol does not want to intimidate, and I repeat, do not want to intimidate this vehicle into doing anything that they really don't want him to do, and the main thing is to get him pulled over as safely as possible, and there's only a couple ways that'll happen. One is him just pulling over and or running out of gas. So at this point, we can only pray that they'll be able to pull this off in a safe measure. Absolutely. Again, Pat, at this point, it is a pursuit, and unfortunately it has a lot of mitigating circumstances because of the high profile of the proposed suspect that's inside the vehicle, which could possibly be and appears to be at this time O.J. Simpson.
And at 5:51 p.m., O.J. calls 911 himself to talk with authorities, and he said that he was on his way to see his mother, and he wanted to see her before he turned himself in or before whatever happens next happens. So he mentions that he wants to end this at his Rockingham estate, and he's on the line with an LAPD officer talking about wanting to kill himself, and the officer talks in the O.J. Made in America documentary about trying to talk him out of that and tried to reason with him, and the last thing they want is for him to commit suicide, and they'll never get the answers they need, or they'll never be able to put him on trial if he is guilty of it, and all of that. So, they're doing whatever they can to avoid him killing himself right there. And obviously this is a huge red flag. If you're innocent of something, why are you going on the run? Why are you going to kill yourself? So it's all just very, very sketchy. So it's just so crazy. I'm just trying to think, like, at that time, like, America's football hero is being followed now by a series of police cruisers on the highway after fleeing investigators for the murders of 2 people. It's such a dramatic fall from grace for a man that was once seen as America's hero. So this chase goes on for, a while, a couple of hours, and there's driving along the freeway. And then shortly after 8 p.m., the Bronco chase comes to an end at O.J.'s Rockingham estate. Police and a SWAT team follow him there, and they end up taking him into police custody once he finally exits the vehicle. So they were able to convince him, either like the police and then also his friend Al Cowlings, who was driving, begging with him not to kill himself, and they're really trying to talk him out of that. So he puts the gun down, gets out of the car, and the police take him into custody. And by this time, there were crowds of people that were lining the streets. So, for the last few miles of the chase, there's crowds lining the street with signs. They're screaming, and they're saying that he's innocent, and they're really supporting him right from the get-go here. And so once they have him in custody after this huge chase, it officially begins the long legal proceedings that eventually lead to the criminal trial in 1995 that then became dubbed the trial of the century. And to this day, is probably still one of the most well-known and infamous murder trials in history. So that's how we kind of get to that point after this long Bronco chase and all of this other stuff. So what do you guys think of, like, the chase itself and everything that's happened so far?
When I initially saw that, like, heard about the chase and stuff, I kind of thought it was like he kind of just wanted to get like a rile out of the police and out of his fans, like, oh, look what I can do. Like I don't really think he was actually going to commit suicide. I don't think that was even a thought in his head. I think this whole chase was just him trying to, like, I don't know, I can't really word it. I think that's what he was going for. I mean, I could be totally wrong, and maybe he was second-guessing himself and really did write that suicide note and whatever, but I think he was just trying to get it aroused out of his fans and out of the media.
And I mean, if you listen to those audio recordings, like they play in the documentary, some of the phone calls with him and the LAPD and them trying to convince, and you can hear Al Cowlings, like his friend, in the background of the call, like begging him to put the gun down and all of this stuff. And I mean, it seems very genuine, but again, he's an actor, so who knows? If he's a terrific actor, maybe he's able to sell that, but it seemed very genuine, like he was torn and either feeling guilty or just was at least seriously considering killing himself. But, if he's a narcissist or if he just loved the attention, then he probably didn't have any intention of doing that. Just wanted to milk it for all it's worth, I guess. I don't know. It's hard to tell, really.
Yeah. I don't know. To me, it kind of just seems like you hear a lot of times even with ex-husbands, ex-wives, like murder-suicides, right? So if he did kill her, then a lot of times the perpetrator would kill themselves. And it's kind of like that's what was happening, but just kind of a delayed reaction. He killed her and now he's going to kill himself in this big spectacle, kind of get his like last moment of fame here. And it was kind of his friends that talked him down from that. And so I kind of do believe that maybe he was so distraught, either because he did it, he was going to get caught, go to jail, so he's going to kill himself, or because someone murdered, you know, the woman that he loved, and he's so, again, so distraught that he's going to end his life. So yeah, I don't know. I don't know if it was just an act. I'm kind of torn.
Yeah, and these are like obviously questions we'll never know the answers to because the only one who knows is OJ. But either way, I mean, doesn't look good if you're completely innocent. Why are you fleeing the police and all of that stuff? And I don't know. It just seemed, really hard to tell. But it's just crazy to think that it kind of blew up to be this huge thing. And it really became one of the iconic things about this case was this Bronco chase and how kind of captivated everyone was by watching it in real time.
I was going to say, it's also like if you don't know the narrative of what's going on, it just kind of looks like he's going on this Sunday drive. And because it wasn't a high-speed chase, right? It was like a low-speed chase. They were just kind of cruising down the highway and look, all these cop cars are after him. So it's just kind of interesting that they weren't even trying to flee, really. The cops were like right there the whole time.
Yeah, and now it's like only in retrospect that we know all the little details about, the evidence that was kind of against him at this point, or at least what they suspected was evidence, or obviously they had enough to charge him and all of that sort of thing. So you don't really know that. You just kind of see 1 minute you're told, oh, he was supposed to surrender and now he's on the run. And then you see this chase. So yeah, people don't really know what's going on. It's confusing. And then there's people who are, lining the streets, like I said, saying he's innocent. And then there's other people who have already made up their minds that he's guilty. So it's just kind of this huge, huge thing and this huge debate already. And this is only this is like the 17th of June is when this chase happens, which is like 4 days after the murder. So already in 4 days, it's like blown up into this huge thing. And this is crazy.
Yeah, and apparently there was like 95 million people that tuned in to watch like this chase. It was on every station that was on TV at the time kind of went to this Bronco chase rather than the show that they were actually showing. So yeah, it was huge news and did not make him look good at all.
Yeah, America loved him, so mostly everyone was a fan of him. So seeing like your most beloved football hero being chased by the police live on air and like seeing all this stuff, and obviously we wouldn't have heard like the phone, like when you're watching it in the documentary, you hear they kind of play the phone calls that's happening between OJ and the police over like the footage of the chase. Obviously at that time you're not hearing any of that, so if you're just a viewer watching it at the time, it's like you're just seeing this like white car being chased and it's like really boring. It just seems like hours of like just this really slow chase. So it's just like, wow. I'm just trying to think of it like in perspective of like, think of the biggest celebrity in today's age and like imagine if they were accused of murder and then went on a slow speed chase on the freeway. Like how much attention would be put on it now? And this was even before social media, right? And before even really like the 24-hour news cycle or like true crime was a huge thing. It was just, but it still captured that much attention even though it was before the.
Like I always wonder, like if he actually just turned himself in, like would we be talking about the trial and all of this? Like there wouldn't be that much to talk about, really. Do you know what I mean? Like if he would just turn himself in and took the plea deal or whatever he did. No, I'm not saying he was guilty or whatever. I'm just saying if that was the outcome, like we wouldn't even be talking about how high profile it was, really.
Yeah, and it's mostly like the reason that got so much attention was because of the long trial that happened, and then like obviously the end result is really what makes it stick out in people's mind. But yeah, if he just surrendered and didn't have the car chase or the long trial, it would have been like, okay, this guy committed 2 murders and then, it is what it is. He gets put in jail and whatever. But because of everything that happened and it wasn't that simple, it just became so infamous. Yeah, any kind of last thoughts before we wrap up this part?
I'm just interested to see how, well, I mean, I know how it turns out, but I'm just like excited to like dig deep into the trial and discuss it because it's very interesting.
Yeah, so definitely we're going to end this part here. Definitely tune into part 3. We're going to go dive into, in part 3, we're going to, go over the trial and talk about, the major things that happened in the trial, the major pieces of evidence and all of that sort of stuff. And we'll get through that in part 3, which will lead us to the eventual verdict and the aftermath sort of in the 4th part. So thank you so much for joining us. It's been really fun to be back for these first 2 episodes so far, talking to you all and kind of going through this case. And we always would love your feedback as well. Like if you like our new approach to the season, we'd love to hear any suggestions you have. But we hope you're enjoying it so far. You can follow us on all the social medias at Crime Family Podcast. Join our Patreon group if you would like to support the podcast and get some extra content throughout the season. Usually like update episodes with certain cases we've covered or any other, maybe some mini episodes. For a small fee, you can support the podcast and get some extra content. Like the podcast, leave us a review, all of that good stuff that you do. And we'd love to hear your feedback. And you can also visit our website at crimefamilypodcast.ca. We have, episode outlines and, a contact form. You can leave us some feedback there. You can leave us a voicemail if you want to call in and give us your thoughts and all that stuff. So we'll be back with part 3. Yeah, thanks so much. And we'll see you soon. Till then, take care.
Bye.
Bye.